So most of the conversation that we're having about lethal means counseling and conversations about firearms are ways to do things correctly. But I think what a lot of folks are wondering about are how things can go poorly. And I'm certainly not asking you to give horror stories of your worst conversation about firearms. But I'm curious if you could give folks a sense of ways that these conversations about safe firearm storage, can go poorly or go off the rails.
Yeah, I think one thing that I've learned is to kind of go in with it not having a set plan of where this conversation is going to go or what metaphors I'm going to use, because I think you can easily find out that maybe that metaphor doesn't apply to them. Or, if you're trying to talk about like, well, how often, do you really have break-ins happening in your area? Even though like for a lot of places it might be very minimal, but that person themselves is like, well, I've had it happen like at least twice this month. So not feeling you're having a specific route that you're going to take in that conversation, as well as a specific end goal. Because I think people have their reasons for having a firearm and for why they store them. And I came into it realizing that it's not my job to kind of tell them what to do. It's just to meet them at what they're willing to do and see how we can get there.
Yeah, and I think kind of similar to that is going in with a clean slate on like your expectations for how that person's going to interact with this conversation, because you might have already, done some stuff with them and expect that they're going to be like not at all open to what you're going to say. And then you get in there and they're like the most open person and like really on board with it. Or you can have the opposite situation where you're like really expecting that this person's going to be really open to this conversation. Then you get in there and they're like way more hesitant and not super interested. And so like Sam said, going in with like not having expectations or a plan, but also like not having expectations for how that person's going to interact with you interpersonally or with this conversation.
That all makes a ton of sense to me. One thing that jumped out at me too, though, is that I would imagine in conversations about firearms, sometimes folks are going to say things that you, as the clinician, or if you're not a clinician, if you're just a loved one or a friend, some things that you just disagree with and feel the urge to correct folks on. I could imagine, though, that arguing might not necessarily lead to the most successful conversation. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's hard when you're in those situations when people say things that maybe are like, are wrong or are just like offensive in some way. And I wouldn't say that happened a lot, but I can say that it did happen. And I can remember like one in particular regarding like suicide and the person being very like, well, that's basically their prerogative, right? And like that was like a hard situation to handle. And so not pushing back, not being like offended and argumentative in that moment, which in some ways is kind of your instinct because it's like so emotionally, like it evokes a lot of emotion, right? But to actually be like, all right, this is not the path that we're going to get anywhere. Let's talk about something different and get off of this because this is clearly a hot button situation that I need to kind of move away from.
Yeah, I agree with that. That I think you have to be pretty open-minded about the conversation and not look at it as like there's a right or wrong to it, and just realize like that's their point of view and either explore it a little bit more and show that you're like empathetic and understanding of that being their point of view, and then seeing if there's a way that that conversation can potentially open up a door for another path to discuss as well.